We've done about maybe 4 debates publicly with Muslims over the last 3 or 4 years. We've had a lot of interactions, a lot of discussion in Discord and in various formats. And so I have a decent idea of what the arguments are for Islam throughout these last few years. And so I'd like to sum up the top 5 reasons why I'm not a Muslim and give you the boiled down package. If you want a longer version of all of these topics, then we've done multiple live streams about all these topics. I'll list those down below. But the first reason, and they're not in any specific order because they all kind of relate to one another and they all hinge on one another because it's kind of an integrated worldview in my perspective in terms of what the biblical narrative is in terms of covenant theology from the Old to the New Testament, the consistency there and the fulfillment of prophecies and so forth. So the first reason that I don't find Islam convincing is its doctrine of Tawheed versus the doctrine of the Trinity. This has come up in multiple debates, and the main reason why this doesn't work for me as an argument is that if you know the Old Testament, we've covered in many cases the multiple references throughout the Old Testament to Father, to angel of the Lord, who is, in our view, the Logos, who is Christ, the second person, and also to the Holy Spirit. So we have throughout the Old Testament both a reference to the unity of God as well as to multiplicity in the sense of Father, Son, and Spirit. So the idea of the Trinity is not something invented by the New Testament writer. It's not invented by the Council of Nicaea. It's something rooted in the Old Testament, and it's referenced all throughout the New Testament text, including the Gospels, to give an account of in what sense there's unity in God and in what sense there's distinctions and in what sense the Son comes to do the role of salvation in time and space, that is, to be incarnate. And in Unitarian theology of any flavor, we really have a God that is only relating to the world in terms of it's a sort of a slavish relationship. In other words, God is not first and foremost love because there's not a communication of love without a created order. And so to exercise the attribute of love, for example, requires creation. In the Trinitarian doctrine, there's a community of persons in the triad from all eternity who have an interchange and exchange of love. And so the exercising of certain attributes like love or divine providence are not contingent upon the creatures. It's not contingent upon the created order. But in any Unitarian conception, you're going to have this lack on the part of the deity who then, when he creates, now takes upon himself new actions and new attributes, which in most Unitarian descriptions of God requires him to undergo some kind of change. And that was the central point that I brought up in regard to divine simplicity from the Muslim point of view in the Azrar Rashid debate. And I don't think that point was ever grasped. So in other words, multiplicity in God or predicates or different names of God is not something that's a unique problem or issue that Christian theology has to grapple with. In fact, ancient rabbinical theology of the Jews also grappled with this problem precisely in trying to understand who the theophanies were in the Old Testament, these different personas from the Father that are manifesting in time and space that are worshiped and called the Lord. For us, that's quite obviously, as Ezekiel says, one like the Son of Man. If you want to watch my video about the Trinity in the first 10 chapters of Ezekiel, it's right here below. And he notes that the glory of God was present in this form of God, in this Son of God, or one like the Son of Man. The same that one like a Son of Man that Daniel saw there in the fiery furnace. And so the angel of the Lord, given that title and that description of Yahweh, is a clear reference throughout the Old Testament in many, many instances. In the book of Genesis 49, where the angel of the Lord is called the Redeemer, Exodus 3 and 23. In these chapters, again, we have references to the angel of the Lord as distinct from the person of the Father. And so it's actually the Torah itself, and by extension, the law, the prophets, and the wisdom texts, and the Psalms that actually give us the root of the Trinitarian deity, not some philosophical speculation, even though philosophy was later used to clarify and give an explanation for different ways in which God relates to the world, or how God relates in terms of the triad, person to person. The other point that should be made here is that the word God is not a rigid designator. It doesn't necessarily pick out a single Unitarian referent in all cases. In the biblical sense, God can pick out the person of the Father. It can pick out the person of the Son. It can pick out the person of the Spirit. It can pick out the divine essence. It can pick out the divine attributes or energies. In fact, the word God can even be used to pick out angels and demons and humans. So there's nothing specific about God that requires it have a single Unitarian referent. And that's a big undercutting of a lot of the argumentation that comes from Muslims, especially because they often argue on the basis of their version of natural theology that it leads to a necessary kind of Unitarian deity. But there's also a problem that they excuse themselves from, and in some of their commentaries in the Middle Ages, the Sunni commentaries, they even say, don't even ask this question because it's unlawful to ask, which is, well, if we critique the Christian on the basis of utilizing Father, Son, and Spirit and real distinctions, how do we escape that dilemma when we make distinctions in Allah in regard to the attributes and the attributes to the essence, and in regard to Allah's different actions or the comparisons of Allah to creatures? And this is another problem related to this issue, which is that Tanzih, the doctrine that Allah is nothing like creatures, conflicts with the claim and the usage throughout Islamic theology of analogical predication, which is to compare Allah to creatures. He's merciful. He's just. Well, what do those things mean? Well, we know what they mean because we know what justice is in the world. We know what it is to be merciful. And so we are analogically predicating of God things that, according to the Quran, bear no similarity at all to him. And so if that's the case, they don't tell us anything about him. And so all of the 99 names and the attributes would thus be undercut. And so again, how do you reconcile this unity with this multiplicity of names and escape the dilemma that they try to put us under when we speak of a multiplicity in terms of Father, Son, and Spirit? And so it's really a double standard. And the same goes on in terms of the deity of Christ, which is the next point, again, related to the Trinitarian position, which is that Christ throughout the Gospels, even if you try to pick out different areas that you think are corrupted texts, which is not actually an argument that the Quran uses, it's a later argument that they've adopted from higher critical scholarship, the Gospel refers to the deity of Christ all the time, especially the Gospel of John. And in regard to the deity of Christ, this is really what tells us that he is the Son of God, the second person of the Godhead. He has, according to John, all of the powers and prerogatives and attributes that the Father has because he shares the Father's nature. And so if Jesus is a prophet, then he is clearly contradicting the Unitarian theology of Islam. And so he can't be a true prophet because remember, a true prophet, according to Deuteronomy 13 and Deuteronomy 18, two chapters that tell us the criteria for who is a true prophet, notes that it's not just whether he does signs and wonders and predicts the future. Even if he does those things, Deuteronomy 13 says, he cannot teach a different theology. So if he departs from the theology that's in the Torah or in the law, the prophets in general, or the writings, then he's departed from the previous revelation. And this is really one of the strongest arguments for me, which is the second point. The first was the Trinity and the deity of Christ. And I've done longer talks on that, going through the totality of the scriptures for both the Trinity and the deity of Christ. Below, if you want those, I'll have them linked. But the next argument would be the issue of the fact that the Torah has a revelation about who the Messiah will be, and it came first, right? It came before the Gospels, and it came before the Quran. And so it states in Deuteronomy 13 and Deuteronomy 18 that any coming prophet has to be in continuity with the previous revelation. Now, the previous revelation, when we speak of the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, it includes extensive chapters that deal with the temple, the liturgical worship, the altar, the sacrifice, the priesthood, and all of this imagery, iconography that goes into the temple. And this is really gone and completely forgotten and basically given no significance or credence in Islam. And yet in significant chunks, entire books of Leviticus, entire books almost like Numbers, or even gigantic portions of Exodus deal with this liturgical practice of worship, temple worship, iconography, and all of that. And we are told that that is given by God. In fact, the Quran itself says twice that the Torah was given by God. Now, the Torah includes all of these statements that this liturgical worship, in fact, to be clear, it's in Surah 3:1, and it's in Surah 10:35, that the gospel and the Torah and the prophets are given by God. And so whoever said this was just completely ignorant of what was actually in those texts. And so what's actually in those texts is that you have to have an eternal priesthood, an eternal sacrifice, eternal liturgical worship, which is what Exodus says Moses received from heaven, the types of the things in heaven Moses put into practice on earth. We believe that Christ, as the new Moses, when he fulfilled the animal sacrifices and the ceremonial aspects of the Old Testament law, he didn't get rid of everything sacrificial and ceremonial. In fact, the apostles established a liturgical worship pattern on the temple and the synagogue service. And for us as Orthodox, that includes icons, iconography, just like in the temple, Solomon's temple. That includes a sacrifice of the Eucharist, the bread and wine of Melchizedek, which Jesus is portraying himself as the new Melchizedek, the fulfillment of the Melchizedekian order of offering bread and wine. We have the incense, we have the imagery, we have the altar of sacrifice, according to Hebrews 13, which is the Eucharistic service. And so if you don't have those elements, then you don't have continuity with the worship of the law. And Islam does not have any of that. That alone shows that they don't have the continuity with the Old Testament. And that's really the clincher for which is the true religion in this regard. Who truly follows the prophets? Well, I know how Jesus worshiped. He went to a liturgical worship. I know how Isaiah and the prophets worshiped. David, they went to the temple and practiced liturgical worship. David wrote dozens of liturgical psalms that relate to the temple and the Ark of the Covenant and all of this iconographic imagery, and ordered antiphonal singing and priesthood and liturgy and sacrifice. None of that is anywhere in Islam. That alone shows that it's not in continuity with what came before, even though the Quran says that it's in continuity with what came before. It's the religion of the prophets. It's not, because all the prophets went to the liturgical worship service of the temple. And the only response that Islam has to this is that they arbitrarily suddenly say, oh, all of that was corrupted and misused and invented and added to the text. But your text says that the law was not corrupted. And it wouldn't do you any good if you were able to establish that, because that would mean that gigantic portions of what you said came before are all corrupted. So now you don't have a standard to know what aspects were true in terms of what came before and what aspects are false if you're already canceling out 30, 40, 50, 60% of the law and the prophets as invalid and corrupted. And you'll notice that when you argue with Muslims about the deity of Christ or the Trinity or the continuity of the Old Testament, they really just don't have any consistent application of this. They arbitrarily say anytime there's a text that's a problem, that is corrupted. In other words, it's arbitrary. So if your position is arbitrary and it's a double standard because you can't use those arguments on them, that is an extremely weak, indefensible position. So continuity is the next key point, the deity of Christ, the Trinity. And then I want to talk about the weird ethics of Islam. Islam has the position, as I understand it, that Allah can deceive you. Well, if Allah can deceive you, then I'm not in any position as a Muslim to know or have certitude about the Quran or Islam or anything like this, because it's entirely possible that Allah is deceiving me, even though I think that I am engaging in, proper worship and so forth. And so really the history of Islam, in my view, is built on a lot of ignorance of what was actually in the law and the prophets. In fact, when you look at what apparently the Quran and Muhammad thought Christianity was, it was this really bizarre version that's not Trinitarian at all. So he heard words and misunderstood what they meant, and thought that there was this other kind of Trinity, and then it was this or that. And I'll put below the link to Kai's video that shows this from the Quran, this misunderstanding as to what we were actually teaching. And so that helped to foster, I think, a lot of the confusion. And again, in most of the discussions and debates I've had, probably 99% of the Muslims have no familiarity with what's actually in the Torah and the prophets. And that's a big, roadblock here, because the Torah and the prophets came first, and we have texts that are way older than the Quran. And so they lay down the law as to what is the rule of continuity, not something that came thousands of years later. And so then the question is, well, does the gospel, is the message of the apostles in Christ in continuity with what's in the Torah and the prophets? And I think absolutely. And we've done many live streams demonstrating that. So I would also point out the iconoclasm. I mean, God in the biblical presentation creates a beautiful world. He's described as the beautiful one. And, beauty is something that we oftentimes don't necessarily directly connect with theology, with God. We think it's something else or relates to something, this world or whatever. But actually, St. Dionysius says that God is the ultimate good, the ultimate beautiful one. And that's also in Scripture. And so the point here is that, the beauty of orthodoxy in terms of the aesthetics, in terms of the draw of the imagery and the artwork, while I'm not saying that having images and pretty pictures or something itself proves it, at the same time, we would expect the God of the Old Testament, who does expect his worship to be full of imagery, full of icons, and to be beautiful. In fact, the Holy Spirit, it says, guided people in the Old Testament to beautify the temple in an extraordinary way with gold and with embroidery and with images of angels and Eden and all of these things that are clearly not iconoclastic. And so the idea that God then wants everybody to suddenly be iconoclastic, centuries later, after he's already given this worship that is iconodual or given to iconic representation, is just a flat out contradiction. Furthermore, the books, right, the religion of the book, we could say, whether it's the Torah, whether it's the gospel, or whether it's the way that Muslims view the Quran. I mean, many of them believe in an eternal Quran. And then there's these copies on earth of the eternal Quran, which are essentially a version of an incarnation, even though there's really not any possible way for there to be an incarnation in their system. I know they don't worship the book, but in another sense, they kind of do, because you believe that there's a created image of something uncreated in the very pages of the Torah, of the Quran itself. Likewise, Judaism would have this same notion of the Torah. They treat the Torah as if it is a kind of incarnate, sort of image of the uncreated. And if those things are the case in those religions, then it's not impossible or absurd to think that God himself could be in the created order, but also transcendent, right? If there are theophanies in the Old Testament, then that's already a resolved issue. It's already in divine revelation. And so we must accept it. So those are the key arguments. I think that iconoclasm itself is an overlooked argument, because if you think about the principles of God and the world, of God revealing himself in the world, of God being imaged or present in a theophany, a theophanic manifestation, whether it's the theophanies or whether it's the principle of the written texts, those are created. The written texts are created things that point us to the divine. The theophanies are not created. They're uncreated that point us to the divine. And so this, to me, is something that really just undercuts the totality of Islamic presentations and theology. And oftentimes the argument is really nothing to do with any of this as to why people convert. Most of the time the argument is just that, well, they're more based and so forth. Well, they're not. I mean, if the theology says that Allah can deceive you and he can basically lie to you, I mean, how is that more based or trad, right? It only has the appearance of that. But I would grant that most of Western so-called Christianity is bogus and is subverted and co-opted. And so in that regard, none of those things actually, in my view, represent Christianity. So these are the key 5 arguments that I think are the strongest points against Islam, and why it really doesn't match up at all in terms of being consistent with what came before. And really the only people who could be convinced of that are people that are really ignorant of the Old Testament and the prophets and even the Gospels by extension. If you would hit like and share, I want to add too that we have a show sponsor, and you should definitely get those products at shock.com. You can also buy my books at my website at Jay's Analysis in the shop.